2:45, and it's time to start. So my name is Andreas Bergström. I am the Deputy Director of the think tank Forest, and together with the LO we have been organizing, well, the organizers officially are of course the parliamentarians, but we have been behind the stage, so to say. So I will start the first session, which is about environmental taxes and more specifically carbon pricing. And I will first welcome up Professor Dr. Ottmar Edenhofer, and Ottmar is Professor of Economics of Climate Change at the Technical University of Berlin, and also Deputy Director and Chief Economist of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So Ottmar will give a presentation, and after that we will have Thomas Sterner, who is professor at the University of Gothenburg and also at the Collège de Paris. And Thomas is also on our scientific council at Forest. So Thomas will comment, and then after that we will have 4 parliamentarians who will comment the whole thing. And 2 of them are Emil and Leif, whom you've already met, and it will also be Mats Persson from the Liberals and Janine Alm Eriksson from the Green Party. So I'll now give the stage to Ottmar. Please welcome up.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation to Stockholm. It's a great pleasure to discuss this important issue on tax reform and carbon pricing with my good friend Thomas Sterner. We've worked together for many years. And it is always a particular privilege to come to Sweden and to Stockholm, which is definitely one of my favorite countries. I'm not saying this because I am here, but it's the simple truth. Now, my presentation has basically 2 parts. The first part is a very pessimistic, and I could say a depressing part. And when I have achieved the maximum of my pessimism, so then I start to become increasingly optimistic. And then I will conclude my presentation with an optimistic outlook, which has a lot to do with carbon pricing, in particular carbon pricing in the European context. But before I go into the European issues, let me highlight a little bit the global perspective, because it seems to me it is incredibly important to have the global perspective, and in particular the Paris Agreement in mind when we think about the future of climate and energy policy around the globe and also in Europe. So my first and important insight is almost trivial. And it basically says that, and this is what we have highlighted within our 5th assessment report of the IPCC, that the emissions are rising, and even in the last decade. So we have observed an increasing growth rate, and the data in the IPCC report are a little bit outdated, but even if you take into account the last 5 years, it is clear that despite of international negotiations on climate change, so there is no indication that the global emissions will achieve a maximum in the next few years. And there is a reason for this. And here I would like to explain this reason a little bit more carefully. And this is incredibly important, in particular in Europe, because many Europeans have this important aspect not in mind. So, and my main argument is that we are in the middle of a renaissance of coal. And the renaissance of coal drives the global carbonization of our world economy. We are not decarbonizing. We are not decarbonizing our world economy. And even if I'm at risk to highlight a little bit a complicated figure, I would like to explain this component carefully. So basically, you can see here the most important driving forces for emissions: population, GDP per capita, and it is obvious, and to a certain extent it's a good thing, that in the last decade the GDP per capita was the most important driver because the world economy had a significant growth trajectory. So these positive aspects, or the drivers with a positive sign, are compensated by energy intensity, which basically means we learn, not just in Europe, but around the globe, to produce our GDP with less primary energy input. So in that sense, it's a good thing, but what you can see here is, so the progress in energy efficiency was not sufficient to overcompensate population growth and GDP per capita. Now there's a third component, and this third component looks at first glance as a small one, and this is carbon intensity. Carbon intensity measures the carbon content of 1 unit primary energy. And in the last 3 decades, from the 70s to the beginning of 2000, the carbon intensity has been declined because we have substituted coal-fired plants around the globe with gas-fired plants. But in the last decade, the whole trend has been reverted. Because of the enormous decline in coal and the increase of the gas prices, so coal becomes incredibly competitive. And this is the reason why the carbon intensity, instead of declining, has been increased over the decade. Now I will argue that this trend has not stopped. And this is the most important thing, and this is very worrying when we talk about the climate agreement, the implications of the climate agreement, because this is the past. Now we have to ask the question, what are the plans of the nation states? What are the plans of the different countries? Do they plan to get rid of coal, or do they continue to carbonize the world economy? Now, before I explain this a little bit more carefully, so let me highlight a very simple fact. And the simple fact is, so why should we be concerned about climate change? So there are many reasons, and the IPCC has highlighted a lot of those reasons. For example, the change of the monsoon dynamics in China and India, the risk of the dieback of the Amazonian forest, all this large-scale risk to change, which has the potential to change the planetary machinery. But there are also quite economic reasons. And the economic reason why we should be concerned about climate change is simply that climate change has an impact on our labor productivity. So in many countries, the temperatures are too low for an optimum. In some countries, they are too high. And if we take into account that climate and weather can have a significant impact on labor productivity, so then we accept that there are gradual changes caused by climate change which could drive the impacts of climate change on our economy quite significantly. And a colleague of ours, Marshall Burke, he has published a paper in Nature clearly showing that the impacts of climate change, the purely economic impacts of climate change, are unevenly distributed around the globe. Interesting enough, Europe is a winner, but for example, the Middle East and Africa is a loser because of the increase of global mean temperature. And now, currently, under the impression of the migration crisis in Europe, so I will not go into the detail what will happen if Europe has an increasing growth trajectory and we have significant decline of human well-being, for example, in the Middle East and in North Africa. So this is important to understand that climate change has not just a significant risk that the planetary machinery will be disturbed, but also climate change can have quite significant impacts on our economies. So this is the reason why the IPCC has characterized the climate change issue as an issue of risk management. So what we have to do is to reduce the risk, to reduce the likelihood that the damages can happen. And this was the reason why in the Paris Agreement most countries argued, and in the end they agreed on that they would like to limit the increase of global mean temperature around 2 degrees, and even they made a more ambitious statement that we should try to stay below 2 degrees. Now, I will not go into the details about the climate impacts and the risks. I take this for granted, but this has strong economic implications. And the most significant economic implication is that there is only a limited amount of carbon budget available which can be released into the atmosphere from now until the end of the century. And we did in the IPCC this calculation. It turns out that the carbon budget, which is consistent with the 2-degree target, roughly with the 2-degree target, is around 3,000 gigatons CO2. We already exhausted 2,000 gigatons since industrialization, so the remaining carbon budget is about 1,000 gigatons CO2 for the rest of this century. Now, is this large or small? So at least what we can say is that if we want to limit the increase of global mean temperature around 2 degrees, so until 2050 we have to reduce global emissions between 40 to 70%. Now you might argue, why is the IPCC not able to narrow this range? This range has nothing to do with the uncertainty in the climate system. This has a lot to do with the technological uncertainty about a specific portfolio of technological options. And this portfolio is called carbon dioxide removal technologies. These are technologies, for example, afforestation or a combination of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which allows us to compensate CO2 which has been already released into the atmosphere. Due to the fact that we are on a carbonization pathway, due to the fact there is so much coal underground, we need these technologies, otherwise it will be very hard and very costly to limit the increase of global mean temperature around 2 degrees. Now let me say a few words on the Paris Agreement. And this is, I hope I can convince you, that this is in the end, from the point of view of the aspirational goals, a quite ambitious agreement. Now again, so this is the carbon budget, which is consistent with the 2 degrees scenario. There's an uncertainty range, but roughly it's about 1,000 gigatons CO2. For a 1.5 degree target, only 200 gigatons CO2 are left, and this 1.5 degree target is mentioned in the Paris Agreement because the small island states argued that they want to limit the global mean temperature around 1.5 degrees, and they asked the global community to acknowledge their exposure to these climate risks. But now it comes to the very, very pessimistic part. Now these are the aspirational goals. Very aspirational, and very aspirational. But now let's look at that, what the countries have decided. Until 2030, they said, we are willing to provide voluntary contribution to the global good of climate policy. And they basically say, and this is called the intended nationally determined contributions, which is nothing more, nothing else, that the countries say, we will exhaust the global carbon budget around 800 gigatons CO2. Basically, they are arguing that until 2030, they will exhaust basically the whole available carbon budget. Now, let's look a little bit what are the plans of the countries participating in the Paris Agreement on coal. The existing coal infrastructure and the planned coal-fired plants around the globe, 1,400 gigawatts roughly, basically means that over the lifetime of these coal-fired plants, so the countries are using basically around 400 gigatons of the global carbon budget. This basically means, and since Paris we haven't seen any plans or any intentions, any indications that they change the investment plans and the infrastructure plans regarding coal. So basically what this number is showing is either this intended nationally determined contributions are inconsistent, the environmental ministers provide the voluntary contributions and the economic ministers around the globe are responsible for the infrastructure planning, or most of the countries might argue we will not reduce emissions in the power sector, we will do it in the transport sector and the heat sector, but as everybody knows that the marginal abatement costs in the power sector are much lower than in the transport sector and in the other sectors of our economy. So this is something which I would like to highlight here. So we have seen already in the last 2 decades a significant renaissance of coal, but despite of the Paris Agreement, so we are again on a carbonization pathway. And from my point of view, it is now a small window of opportunity for the next 10 years, which decides if we can achieve the 2-degree target or not. If all these coal-fired plants are built and implemented, so it will be very hard to achieve a 2-degree target, because if all these coal-fired plants are implemented and built, so it will be very, very costly then to reduce the emissions after 2030 around 6% per year or so. This will become very costly and from a political point of view almost invisible. So, and this is something which I would like to highlight here. This was the numbers since 2011, but since 2011 we have 5 years spent, and so in the last 5 years we have already used 200 gigatons, so the whole carbon budget calculation reduces the whole thing around minus 200 gigatons. So in fact we have not 1,000 gigatons available, we have around 600, and for the 1.5-degree target, each ton we will emit today has to be compensated in the future. Basically, there is no longer any kind of carbon budget available. And these are the plans which I have already discussed. Now, I would like to come to this whole issue of carbon pricing. And what you can see here is, this is in a nutshell the economics of climate change. At least the economics of climate change mitigation. So roughly, there are 1,000 gigatons available. And if we want to be on the safe side, it's just 800 gigatons CO2. But there are 50,000 gigatons CO2 underground in form of coal, oil and gas. We are not running out of fossil fuels in the 21st century. The fossil fuels are not scarce at all. What is scarce is the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere, but not the fossil fuel resource and reserves. Admittedly, we will not use all the fossil fuels underground because they are increasing extraction costs, but we did a calculation. So even if we compare this with the economic viable resources and reserves, so it turns out that a 2-degree target has the implication that 70% of coal has to remain underground and 1/3 of oil and 1/3 of gas. Under a very strong assumption. And the assumption is carbon capture and storage has to be available. Carbon capture and storage means we capture CO2 from large-scale coal, gas or biomass plants and sequester the CO2 underground, which basically means that we have an additional reservoir underground available. So then we can postpone a little bit the phase out of coal. If carbon capture and storage is not available because of economic, political or social reasons, so 90% of coal, 2/3 of oil and gas has to remain underground. So this is the huge challenge of climate policy. And irrespective of the precise numbers of the budget, You might argue we want to have 100 gigaton more or less. This doesn't matter. What matters is that it is the limiting disposal space and the abundant availability of the fossil fuel resources. Now, what's the solution? I see basically three solutions. The first solution is believing and hoping for a miracle. I'm coming from Germany, from the southern part in Bavaria, so a Catholic community, and I believe in miracles, but I do not rely on them. So what's the miracle? The miracle is tomorrow we wake up and we realize that wind and solar, the levelized costs of electricity for wind and solar, are so cheap that nobody has any incentive to use coal. Even if this miracle happens, and we have very cheap renewable energy sources, and I believe in the next few decades we will see much more technological progress in this area. Nevertheless, this means that you have more renewables, but at the same time the abundant availability, even the abundant availability of renewables, make the use of fossil fuels even cheaper. So people have an incentive then to use coal again, and gas and oil, which basically means with technological breakthroughs in the sector of the renewables, this is only a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition that 90% of coal remains underground. There is then a second option. The second option is we could compensate the owners of coal, oil and gas to remain their resources underground. This could be an option. But again, the incentive problem is not resolved. Why? If I compensate you for leaving fossil fuels underground, then you have a very strong incentive to invest in the exploration of new oil, gas and coal fields. Because you can then increase the compensation level. So the only way how to deal with that is, from my point of view, we have to implement a reasonable carbon pricing scheme. A carbon price does three wonderful things. First, a carbon price makes CO2-free technologies competitive. Second, a carbon price penalizes the use of fossil fuels. And third, the carbon price generates revenues. And now I've become increasingly optimistic. Because the most optimistic aspect of my presentation is that climate policy reduces the asset values of the owners of coal, oil and gas. This might be very depressing. But the good news is, if we impose a carbon price on our economies, which is consistent with the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere, the revenues coming from these taxes are by far larger than the devaluation of the assets of the owners of coal, oil and gas. So carbon pricing is a solution for the climate problem. It is a solution for finance ministers, but the crucial thing is, and the challenge, the political economy challenge is, how can we implement such a carbon pricing scheme? And here I would like to highlight just a proposal which I have worked out with my colleague Axel Ockenfels from Germany, and the idea is a very simple one. Now, first of all, we want to convince the countries that they translate their intended nationally determined contributions, which basically means their voluntary contributions, in a kind of an implicit carbon price. We have done this, and you can see that all the contributions have an implicit carbon price. Some countries have a very high level of efforts, and some countries believe that they cannot afford a high carbon price. And this is what we expect. But basically, translating the voluntary contributions into a carbon price makes the whole thing consistent, it makes them comparable, and everybody knows what the countries what a country wants and can contribute to the global public. Now then, at the first stage, we have different implicit carbon prices. But in the end, we want to launch a process for harmonizing the carbon prices because of competitive issues, carbon leakage issues, and so on. So how can we convince Ethiopia, and how could we convince, for example, even India to increase the level of the carbon price? And from my point of view, there is a wonderful invention in the Paris Agreement, and this wonderful invention is strategic climate finance. So in Paris, there are, in the end, about 100 billion US dollars per year for carbon finance, which basically means supporting countries who want to implement a kind of a mitigation strategy. From my point of view, what we should do is, we should use this climate finance strategically or conditionally, in the sense that when a country accepts a higher carbon price, so then the country can get more revenues from this green climate fund. And this is, from my point of view, one of the most important means, not only to increase the level of ambition, but also to harmonize the carbon prices. And now it comes to the nice thing. The carbon prices a country implements is nothing which or the carbon price a country implements provides revenues for the country domestically. So in contrast to an emissions trading scheme, they have huge transfers. So in this carbon pricing scheme we have in mind, this basically means that a country has the revenues domestically available. And what can a country do with these revenues? First of all, a country could reduce other distortionary taxes. A country could reduce public debt. But for many countries, it's even more important that they could use the carbon revenues for investing in infrastructure, because there's a huge infrastructure gap around the globe. In sanitation, clean water, clean electricity, and so on. We have done the calculation, which shows that when we reduce the subsidies for the fossil fuels and we have a moderate carbon price in many developing countries, in 60 countries we could afford universal access to clean water and to clean electricity. This is just to show what is the potential of carbon revenues, because carbon revenues has exactly these three advantages: incentivizing new technologies, penalizing fossil fuels, but also to generate income which can be used to invest in the countries, and these investments, in particular these infrastructure investments, could increase the competitiveness of these countries. And by the way, reducing the subsidies of fossil fuels is absolutely necessary, because worldwide and at average we subsidize 1 ton CO2 with 150 US dollars. 150 US dollars subsidies for each ton CO2. So given this number, there is no surprise that we are on a carbonization pathway instead of a decarbonization pathway. And these are the areas, the most important areas in the next decade for infrastructure investments. And there is a huge investment and finance need, and carbon pricing could provide this thing here. So I will skip this. Now I would like to use the last minutes for some remarks to the European emissions trading scheme. Because what I have in mind for the international debate, which basically means that each country is committed to carbon pricing, it leaves it open if this country wants to implement the carbon price as a tax or as an emissions trading scheme, because you can always design an emissions trading scheme and a tax in a way that both work efficiently and effectively. But we have in Europe now a big problem with our EU emissions trading scheme. Why? What's the big problem? The big problem is that the European emissions trading scheme is the largest and the most important carbon pricing scheme in the world. Next year, probably China will implement also an emissions trading scheme. Other countries are highly interested. But the EU emissions trading scheme is not functioning well. So, and I would like to explain you in a nutshell why it is not working well. Now, first of all, there's a price decline over the last few, I don't know what happened here, but over the last, since 2010, we have a sharp decline in the price for CO2. So you might argue, okay, there was a decline in the price, but why is a decline in the price a problem? The European emissions trading scheme provided a cap, which basically means that the emissions are below the cap, and this is what we intended. And when technological progress was so fast in Europe, which drives the price down, so this is nothing which we should worry about. And I agree, this is something which might be arguable. But if you do a little bit more careful analysis on the European emissions trading scheme, it turns out that it was not technological change which has driven down the CO2 price. It was just the expectations of the investors, and this I would like to explain a little bit more in detail. Only 10% of the price decline can be explained by the market fundamentals. 90%, this is open to debate what happened here. And we did an analysis, a very detailed event analysis. And it turns out that after 2008, the European Commission, with all the political announcements, by and large, destabilized the expectations of the traders in the market. The European emissions trading scheme currently is no longer a marketplace selecting the most cost-effective technologies for the reduction of emissions. The EU ETS is now basically a kind of a device where the traders bet on the expectations about future political decisions. From a social science point of view, this is a wonderful thing, but this is not exactly what we had in mind when we designed the European emissions trading scheme. This basically means, by and large, that the political regulators in Europe have destabilized significantly the price expectations, and the traders on the market do no longer trust the long-term climate and energy policy at the European level. So that's the biggest problem. So there have been a few proposals to get rid of this destabilization of the expectations. I will not go into the detail, but what I would like to highlight here is very simple. What we need is more transparency and a stabilization of the expectation in the market. And one way to do this is just to implement a price floor in the European emissions trading scheme with a minimum price, and I also can live with a maximum price. So this has basically one big advantage, that all the investors can anticipate the price trajectory. Admittedly, it might be very hard and very complicated that the EU Commission can commit to a long-term price path, but this lack of commitment is the problem of the EU ETS, and we have to solve the commitment problem. And as in many emissions trading schemes, there are minimum prices and even price floors. It shouldn't be too complicated to implement such a thing. And there is another part, and this brings me to Sweden and to Germany, which is also quite important. Now, for example, in Germany, after Paris, we are discussing now very heavily the phase out of coal in Germany. You in Sweden are discussing a potential CO2 tax reform, which basically means that different countries have different preferences for climate and energy policy. But the problem is, when we in Germany are phasing out coal under the current European emissions trading scheme, this leads to a situation where we just create additional permits, bringing these additional permits on the market, which leads to a further price decline and creates an incentive for Poland to build more coal-fired plants. And this is a very strange situation, in particular in Germany, where our hotspot in coal is very close to the Polish border. And I do not believe that Germany can phase out coal when then next to the neighborhood people will invest additionally in coal because Germany has phased out coal. So the other aspect is when you are discussing now a CO2 tax reform, which basically leads to more emission reduction in Sweden, we have potentially the same problem that this policy might not be consistent with the EU ETS. So therefore, my proposal is to impose a minimum price, because if you have a minimum price, this at least mitigates significantly this potential of carbon leakage, because with a minimum price you have room for the different countries to implement their own domestic policy. Now let me conclude. First, we are in the middle of a coal renaissance. We have now a window of opportunity for 10 years. If we miss this window of opportunity to phase out coal in an effective and an efficient way, so we can no longer believe that 2 degree or 1.5 degree is within reach. The second aspect is we need carbon pricing schemes at an international level, and I described very quickly and roughly a design of a further development of the Paris Agreement with carbon pricing schemes. And we need carbon pricing schemes at least at the national and in our case at the European level. For this purpose it is absolutely mandatory that the EU emission trading scheme will be reformed and redesigned. And there are many issues which requires a reform and a redesign, but the most important step, short-term and mid-term step, would be implementing a price floor. If we do this and make the EU ETS functioning, so then other parts of the world, in particular China and other Asian countries, might be quite interested to use this as a role model. Otherwise, Europe has already lost its role model in international climate and energy policy. Thank you very much.